What languages did Jesus know and speak? The monolingual Aramaic world theory is outdated. It was fashionable more than a century ago to say he only spoke Aramaic, nothing else. The Greek and the Hebrew must have come later. Some have questioned how can it be that the Jews produced a lot of literature in the centuries prior to the first century, and they produced a lot of literature in the centuries just after, but there seems to be a dearth of literature in the first century. How can that be? Some have come up with all manner of speculative conclusions, including the idea maybe they just stopped writing things. No, we have plenty of evidence that they were writing things. If anyone would like to know why there is a dearth of literature from the time period just before the destruction of the temple, they need only read Josephus's account of the destruction of Jerusalem by Titus. Titus did not say, as you're destroying this city, if you find any documents, bring them back to camp, let's make a copy of them, and then proceed. No, they burned to the ground the literary capital of Judea, and much literature was lost. Let's now take a look at two specific languages. First, let's do Greek. Some have said, nope, Jesus wouldn't have spoken Greek. In Galilee, they were monolingual. No, the evidence has come out decidedly against this. Some still like the theory because they've used it as a foundation for other conclusions they want to prove, but if we stick with the evidence, yeah, they definitely knew Greek. Let's look at a few examples. First are the ossuaries, the bone boxes. The inscriptions, what we might call epitaphs today, in many of them are written in Greek. So ask yourself this question. Are you going to bury your loved ones with an epitaph written in Mandarin Chinese? Well, sure, if that's part of your heritage, your family. But if not, it doesn't matter that Mandarin is the #1 spoken first language in the world today. You're going to use a language that means something to you and to your family. The fact that people were burying their loved ones with epitaphs in Greek shows that there were people who spoke Greek. Let's take a look at some of the scholarship. For previous generations, I recommend the work of Zahn and Sevenster, who argued cogently that yes, people in Galilee spoke Greek. For something more recent, let's take a look at Porter. He has made the case very effectively that people in Galilee surrounded by the Greek-speaking cities of the Decapolis definitely would have spoken Greek. A man who was involved in the community and traveled a fair bit could hardly be expected to have not known Greek. Let's take a look at some quotes that were summarized by John A.T. Robinson in his work Redating the New Testament. From Zahn. Zahn maintained that it would have been impossible for the early Christian leaders to have fulfilled the immediate duties of their office, such as are described in Acts 8 through 11, let alone done anything beyond Palestine, without a good deal of readiness in Greek. Next, from Sevenster. It is no longer possible to refute such a possibility, that they spoke Greek, by recalling that these were usually people of modest origins. It has now been clearly demonstrated that a knowledge of Greek was in no way restricted to the upper circles, which were permeated with Hellenistic culture, but was to be found in all circles of Jewish society, and certainly in places bordering on regions where Greek was much spoken, e.g. Galilee. Robinson also references Weiss, who points out that Paul's audience at the temple expected him to speak to them in Greek. This is a time and place where Greek was being spoken. Now let's take a look at Hebrew. Some have said, well, biblical Hebrew was a dead language in the first century. This is a little bit misleading. First, because the language they were speaking was Mishnaic Hebrew, which is a descendant of biblical Hebrew. Hebrew, like all languages, changed over time. The Hebrew from 1000 BC was different from the Hebrew of 600 BC, was different from the Hebrew of 400 BC, was different from the Hebrew of the first century. Any language does that. But was biblical Hebrew a dead language? Well, more or less in the same sense you might say that Shakespearean English is a dead language. Is it? Well, yes, in the sense that it's not how people speak colloquially, but no in the sense that it's a language that now only exists in academia. Some of the most influential English texts of all time were written in Shakespearean English. For example, the writings of Shakespeare and the King James Bible. These texts aren't just studied by a handful of academics, they aren't just read. They're spoken aloud. In theaters and churches all around the world, people speak and understand Shakespearean English. We'll find that biblical Hebrew in the first century is in a similar boat. Some of the most influential Hebrew texts of all time, like the Torah, Isaiah, were written in biblical Hebrew. And so while the people may not have colloquially spoken biblical Hebrew, they certainly understood it. But now let's direct our attention to Mishnaic Hebrew, a language that was very much alive and spoken in the area in the time where Jesus lived. Frank Luke has compiled some excellent scholarship on this issue, looking at literature from Judaism in Hebrew, demonstrating that this was a living language. To quote his words, that literature includes First Maccabees, originally in Hebrew, the Dead Sea Scrolls, all of the Palestinian Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha, all Palestinian rabbinic literature, the Mishnah, the Tosefta, the Jerusalem Talmud, all the Midrash. The Midrash can be compared to sermon illustrations that would be used in a preaching environment. Note that they were to be told to the common people and were in Hebrew. Additionally, there are multiple letters from late Second Temple Judaism and just after that were also written in Hebrew. The Dead Sea Scrolls alone put the nail in the coffin that people did not know Hebrew at this time. Most of them are in Hebrew, and it's not just copies of the Old Testament where people were copying a scroll and maybe they didn't understand what it meant. No, they've got other literature. People were actually writing and communicating in Hebrew. Claude Tremontant has also spoken on the Targums. Prior to the destruction of the temple, you could give an oral translation of the Hebrew scriptures into Aramaic. So you'd have somebody in the synagogue who's got the Hebrew scroll, and they'll speak orally in Aramaic. But writing the Hebrew scriptures in Aramaic was prohibited. So we're talking about a time where the synagogue has documents written in Hebrew. We can also look at some of the Hebrew scholars. We mentioned Robert Lindsay earlier, who has had no difficulty through his study of the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Gospels in finding that, yes, there is a clear Hebrew structure to this material. They're living in a world in which Hebrew is alive and well. Another interesting example comes from Josephus. He points out a passage where soldiers were speaking in the heat of battle in Hebrew. They had to make really quick calls. You don't have time to think of some clever way to say this in another language. If you're speaking in Hebrew in that setting, clearly this is not the first time you've spoken Hebrew. I'd like to cite some additional material from Frank Luke about teaching in Hebrew. The only collection of rabbinic literature in Aramaic is the Babylonian Talmud. This should not be surprising because it was compiled in Babylon, where Aramaic was spoken. However, even the Babylonian Talmud preserves its Mishnah portion in Hebrew. The commentary on the Mishnah is in Aramaic, but the Mishnah remains in Hebrew. In addition, whenever a later Palestinian rabbi is quoted in the commentary, the quote will be in Hebrew, while the discussion of the quote is in Aramaic. Parables are also preserved in the Babylonian commentary in Hebrew. Parables were intended to be taught to the common people. They were far from academic exercises. Even though thousands of parables have been found in Hebrew, or Greek as recorded in the New Testament, not one parable in the Talmud or anywhere else has been found in Aramaic. We're clearly talking about people who understood that Hebrew was the language of their faith. 3 final points from Frank Luke. The coins. Hebrew inscriptions on coins far and away outnumber Aramaic inscriptions on coins. Second, the rabbinic literature points out that it wasn't just the well-educated who spoke Hebrew. It says that women and children spoke Hebrew. And note, this is a time and place when women often did not have the opportunity to receive an education. And third, Greek has a word for Aramaic, suristi. It never shows up in the New Testament. They talk about people speaking the Hebrew tongue. They had a perfectly good way to refer to Aramaic had they wanted to, and never in the New Testament does this word appear. The problem we run into then, when people try to claim that the early Christians were monolingual Aramaic peasants, is that they're trying to cram a trilingual world into a monolingual box. Some, particularly in the US, have fallen for the assumption that most people speak only one language and it's just a handful of really well-educated people that speak more than one. No, this is a sampling error. This isn't true of most of the world today, and it isn't true of most of the world throughout history. Lots of people speak more than one language. I speak more than one language, and I'm not that special. The best concise summary, admittedly ever so slightly oversimplified, of the trilingual world in which Jesus lived that I've ever encountered is that Aramaic was the language of the home, Hebrew was the language of the synagogue, and Greek was the language of the marketplace.